Hey friends, we are in section 2.2 and we're going to analyze conditional statements. Here's what I need you to do. Write that title down, write down the date, and let's get started. So our first vocabulary word or vocabulary phrase is going to be an if-then statement. And basically, an if-then statement is a statement with a condition, sometimes called a conditional statement. And it's usually in the form of if something, then something. So like, if we go to school, then we will learn. That's an if-then statement. If it's a holiday, I am going on vacation. That's an if-then statement. So if one thing, then something else is going to happen. So if-then statement is going to be important in what we're going to talk about this whole section. Make sure and copy this down. So our if-then statement is sometimes called a conditional statement, right? It's a conditional statement written in this specific way of if-then. But an if-then statement also has parts to it, and those parts to it are called the hypothesis and the conclusion. And the hypothesis and the conclusion are going to be our next two words. Please write these down. So the hypothesis, I'm highlighting in yellow because it always comes after the if word in a if-then statement. And then our conclusion is always going to come after the then word in an if-then statement. So the hypothesis follows if and the conclusion follows the word then. So the hypothesis is the part of the conditional if-then statement that follows the word if. And the conclusion is the part of the conditional if-then statement that follows the word then. We're going to show some examples of that in just a minute, so I want you to leave some space to write that down. Here are two examples of some if-then statements that we should look at. Let's look at this first one. It says, if you study for math, then your grades will improve. This if-then statement has both of the things that we talked about before, a hypothesis and a conclusion. Let us go ahead and highlight the hypothesis. Remember, the hypothesis is what comes after the word if. So you study for math, that is your hypothesis. If you study for math, guess what? Your grades will improve. Our conclusion is your grades will improve. Let's do it again with the next statement. So here in this next statement, we have if the measure of angle A is 99 degrees, then angle A is obtuse. The hypothesis is going to be this portion, the measurement of angle A is 99 degrees, and the conclusion we're going to calculate as the value after, or the words after then, this angle is obtuse. Is that making sense? Hypothesis comes after the word if, and conclusion comes after the word then. And those are the two components of a conditional statement or an if-then statement. Let's talk a little bit more about the different types of statements we could have. In your notes, you should have this chart. I hope you didn't write all over it. This is where we are. If you need to add some additional note paper, please do so. Staple it in and we'll talk about it. So let's go ahead and talk about the different kinds of statements we could have. Fill in this chart with me, please. So the first thing I want you to put in the chart is the word conditional statement, because the first statement we're going to deal with is a conditional statement. But then we're going to deal with different versions of that statement. And the next word I want you to put is the converse. So we'll have the conditional statement and then we'll have something called the converse. After that, we have something called the inverse. So please write that down. And finally, we've got this concept called the contrapositive. So we can start off with a conditional statement, and then we'll have its converse, its inverse, and contrapositive. This sounds like a lot, but we can follow through with it. Please check out this chart and let's work on it together. First, let's start off with a regular conditional statement. So the statement I'm starting off with is this last one. It's just a regular conditional statement. If the measurement of angle A is 99 degrees, then the angle A is obtuse. So the converse to that statement is going to be if angle A is obtuse, then the measurement of angle A is 99 degrees. Notice what we did. The conditional statement is as it is. Its converse is switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. That's what we did there. So the converse is a flipping of the hypothesis and the conclusion. Let's check out what the inverse is. The inverse is when I take the conditional statement just as it is, but I negate each of those original concepts. Watch what happened. Originally it said if the measurement of angle A is 99 degrees, the inverse says if the measurement of angle A is not 99 degrees. It's the opposite. It negates it. It says the opposite, the negative in a way. So watch. We keep the hypothesis and conclusion basically the same, except we negate both in the inverse. So our new statement is, if the measurement of angle A is not 99 degrees, then angle A is not obtuse. Finally, we come to the contrapositive. The contrapositive then takes the inverse and did what the converse did to the initial statement. It switched the inverse's statements around. So now the contrapositive reads, if angle A is not obtuse, then the measurement of angle A is not equal to 99 degrees. I honestly want you to read this over. We need to just pause, read it over for a second, and we're going to talk about which of these statements are true and which ones are false. Read it over, pause me now. All right, hopefully you paused me and you've had some time to consider. Let's look at this together. Let's look at the first conditional statement, the original statement. If the measure of angle A is 99 degrees, then A is obtuse. That's clearly true, right? Like, I don't think anybody can argue with that because we know what the definition of obtuse is. Obtuse just means an angle that's somewhere between 90 degrees and 180. So that's true. Let's check out this one, the converse. If angle A is obtuse, then the measure of angle A has to be 99. That's false, y'all. It could be some other thing. Let's look at the inverse. The inverse, again, was when we looked at the original statement and we just negated everything. We kind of said the opposite. So if the measure of angle A is not 99 degrees, then A is not obtuse. Again, this is not true. It could be something else. Just because the measure of an angle is not 99 doesn't mean that it's not obtuse, right? Let's finally look at the contrapositive. If angle A is not obtuse, then angle A cannot measure 99 degrees. That's what this is saying. And that's true. What we want you to notice is that there's always going to be a relationship between the converse and the inverse and the original statement and the contrapositive. So what I want you guys to get out of this is something that's really important. And that is the fact that when we have these different types of statements, the original statement, the converse of that statement, the inverse of the statement, and the contrapositive, there's something interesting that happens. What happens is that the converse and the inverse are what we're going to call equivalent statements, meaning they ultimately say the same exact thing. And the original statement, the original conditional statement, and the contrapositive are called equivalent statements, meaning if the conditional statement is true, then the contrapositive is going to be true. And if the conditional statement is false, then the contrapositive will be false. Similarly, if the converse is true, inverse is true. If the converse is false, the inverse is false. Remember, those are called equivalent statements. So basically, again, I want to just highlight the idea that equivalent statements are statements that are essentially the same, the equivalent in meaning, and we just talked about two. So when we have, let's say, the conditional statement and the contrapositive, those statements are essentially equivalent. And then when we have the converse and the inverse, those guys are equivalent statements as well. We have a few more vocabulary words, guys. Stay with me. So a couple words that we need to make sure we are familiar with is the idea of perpendicular lines. That's when you have two lines that intersect to form a right angle. So given two lines, let's say we had this line here and this line here. And we can name these lines line L and line M. So, oh, that made that bad. So let's say we've got line M and line L. We could say that they are perpendicular if they form a 90-degree angle. And the way we'd write that in shorthand notation is L, and then we write this upside down T, which means perpendicular, and then M. And what this statement means right here is L is perpendicular to M. Two lines that form a 90-degree angle, when they're intersecting, they're perpendicular. This next phrase is a biconditional statement. A biconditional statement is when the original statement and its converse are both true. So when the original statement and its converse are both true, you have a biconditional statement. Remember that the converse is when you switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So if you can switch the hypothesis and conclusion in a statement and it's still true, then you have a statement that's biconditional. Okay, and our final vocabulary word, but this isn't all of the notes because we still got the example, but the final vocabulary word is this concept of negation. A negation is, and we talked about it a little bit before, it's simply the opposite of the original statement. It's just the opposite of the original statement. With that, guys, I want you to read it over. I want you to prepare to be questioned about some of this stuff, and we're going to apply it in the next video when we talk about the examples. So for right now, you've done enough. I'll talk to you guys soon. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.